Chapter 6. Government and Politics in Mexico. Not too many years ago, observers considered Mexico to be a model for LDCs, less developed countries, around the world. The Mexican Miracle described a country with a rapidly increasing GNP, in orderly transition from an authoritarian to a democratic government. Then, the economy soured after oil prices plummeted in the early 1980s. The peso took a nosedive, and debt mounted during the decade. Ethnic conflict erupted in the mid-1990s when the Zapatistas took over the capital of the southern state of Chiapas and refused to be subdued by the Mexican army. On the political front, the leading presidential candidate was assassinated, and top political officials were arrested for bribery, obstructing justice, and drug peddling. Then, under new leadership, Mexico surprised the world by recovering some financial viability, though through paying back emergency money it borrowed from the United States. In 2000, under close scrutiny by Western democracies, Mexico held an apparently honest, competitive presidential election, and confirmed the emergence of a competitive electoral system. Then, just as pundits were declaring Mexico's path to capitalism and liberal democracy a successful one, the contentious presidential election of 2006 threatened to rock the government's legitimacy to its core. Once again, Mexico survived the uproar, only to be hit hard by the global economic crisis in late 2008. Today it is the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, that attract world consideration, while Mexico draws attention for the drug-fueled violence that has plagued some of its cities in recent years. Still, the election of 2012 confirmed the existence of a competitive party system, with the presidency recaptured by the party that dominated Mexico during the 20th century, but many legislative seats staying firmly in the hands of opposition parties. Despite its uncertain path, Mexico may be seen as a representative for the category of newly industrializing countries. Its purchasing power parity, $17,900, is fairly high, and about 62% of its workers are employed in the service sector. This developing nation is full of apparent contradictions that make its politics somewhat puzzling, but always interesting and dynamic. Mexico is generally described economically as a developing country and politically as a transitional democracy. In both cases, it is at an in-between stage when compared with other countries globally. But the transition has had its surprises, and its successes and challenges may well serve as beacons for other nations to follow. Sovereignty, authority, and power. Like many other Latin American countries, Mexico's source of public authority have fluctuated greatly over the centuries. From the time that the Spanish arrived in the early 16th century until independence was won in 1821, Mexico was ruled by a viceroy, or governor put in place by the Spanish king. The rule was centralized and authoritarian. It allowed virtually no participation by indigenous peoples. After Mexican independence, this ruling style continued, and all of Mexico's presidents until the mid-20th century were military generals. The country was highly unstable during the early 20th century, and even though a constitution was put in place, Mexico's presidents dictated policy until very recently. Significant economic growth characterized the late 20th century, followed by democratization that is currently reshaping the political system. Legitimacy. In general, Mexican citizens consider their government and its power legitimate. An important source of legitimacy is the Revolution of 1910 to 1911, and Mexicans deeply admire revolutionary leaders throughout their history, such as Miguel Hidalgo, Benito Juárez, Emilio Zapata, Pancho Villa, and Lázaro Cárdenas. Revolutions have been accepted as a path to change, and charisma is highly valued as leadership characteristic. The revolution was legitimized by the formation of the Institutional Revolutionary Party, PRI, in 1929. The constitution that was written during that era created a democratic three-branch government, but PRI was intended to stabilize political power in the hands of its leaders. PRI, then, served as an important source of government legitimacy, until other political parties successfully challenged its monopoly during the late 20th century. After the election of 2000, PRI lost the presidency and one house of Congress, so that by 2006, the party held only a minority of seats in both houses of the legislature. Then, in the 2009 midterm election, PRI showed that it was still a viable party by capturing a plurality of seats in the Chamber of Deputies. In 2012, the party won the presidency for the first time since 1994, although it still does not dominate the legislature. Today, sources of public authority and political power appear to be changing rapidly. However, some characteristics carry through from one era to the next. Historical traditions. Mexico's historical tradition may be divided into three stages of its political development: colonialism, the chaos of the 19th and early 20th century, and the emphasis on economic development during its recent history. Authoritarianism. Both from the colonial structure set up by Spain and from strong-arm tactics by military political leaders such as Porfirio Diaz, Mexico has a tradition of authoritarian rule. Currently, the president still holds a great deal of political power, although presidential authority has been questioned during the past few years. Populism. The democratic revolutions of 1810 and 1910 both had significant peasant bases, led by charismatic figures that cried out for more rights for ordinary Mexicans, particularly Amerindians. The modern Zapatista movement is a reflection of this historical tradition, which is particularly strong in the southern part of the country. Power plays divisions within the elite. The elite who led dissenters during the revolutions of 1810 and 1910, the warlords caudillos of the early 20th century, and the politicos versus técnicos of the late 20th century are all examples of competitive splits among the elite. Current party leaders are often at odds, as displayed during the election crisis of 2006. Presidential candidates Andrés Manuel López Obrador, challenge of the election results, threatened to destroy fragile democratic structures, although the crisis passed without destabilizing the country. Instability and legitimacy issues. Mexico's political history is full of chaos, conflict, bloodshed, and violent resolution to political disagreements. As recently as 1994, a major presidential candidate was assassinated. Even though most Mexicans believe that the government is legitimate, the current regime still leans towards instability, and the current outbreak of gang-related violence, especially in the north, seriously challenges the government's authority. Political culture. Mexicans share a strong sense of national identification, based on a common history, as well as a dominant religion and language. The importance of religion. Until the 1920s, the Catholic Church actively participated in politics, and priests were often leaders of populist movements. During the revolutionary era of the early 20th century, the government developed an anti-cleric position, and today, the political influence of the Church has declined significantly. However, a large percentage of Mexicans are devout Catholics, and their beliefs strongly influence political values and actions. Patron Clientelism. The system of cliques based on personal connections and charismatic leadership has served as a glue that has held an agrarian Mexico together through practicing "you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours." The network of camarillas, patron-client networks, extends from the political elites to vote-mobilizing organizations throughout the country. Corruption is one byproduct of patron clientelism. Democratization and industrialization have put pressure on this system, and it is questionable as to whether or not modern Mexico can continue to rely on patron clientelism to organize its government and politics. The defeats of PRI for the presidency in 2000 and 2006 are indications that clientelism may be on the decline, but corporatism still plays a big role in policymaking. Economic dependency. Whether as a Spanish colony or a southern neighbor of the United States, Mexico has almost always been under the shadow of a more powerful country. In recent years, Mexico has struggled to gain more economic independence. Geographic influence. Mexico is one of the most geographically diverse countries in the world, including high mountains, coastal plains, high plateaus, fertile valleys, rainforests, and deserts within an area about 3 times the size of France. Some geographical features that have influenced the political development of Mexico are mountains and deserts. Because large mountain ranges and vast deserts separate regions, communication and transportation across the country is often difficult. Rugged terrain also limits areas where productive agriculture is possible. Regionalism, then, is a major characteristic of the political system. Varied climates. Partly because of the terrain, but also because of its great distance north to south, Mexico has a wide variety of climates, from cold, dry mountains to tropical rainforests. Natural resources. Mexico has an abundance of oil, silver, and other natural resources, but has always struggled to manage them wisely. These resources undoubtedly have enriched the country and the United States, but they have not brought general prosperity to the Mexican people. a long 2,000-mile-long border with the United States. Contacts, including conflicts and migration and dependency issues, between the two countries are inevitable, and Mexico has often been overshadowed by its powerful neighbor to the north. 122 million people. Mexico is the most populous Spanish-speaking country in the world, and among the 10 most populous of all. Population growth has slowed significantly to about 1.1%, but population is still increasing. Urban population. Mexico is urbanized rapidly as people have moved to cities from rural areas. Today, about 3/4 of all Mexicans live in cities of the interior or along the coast. Mexico City is one of the largest cities in the world, with about 21 million inhabitants living in or close to it. The shift from rural to urban population areas during the late 20th century disrupted traditional Mexican politics, including the patron-client system.